Okay, I'm gonna start. Hi, everyone. I'm Daisy. Can you see my screen all right? Cool. All right, so today we are gonna talk about an interesting topic, which is social media. This is something that people use every day, but we don't really think about it when we are doing clinical trials to put it into the design or to put it into to let it involve in the trials. But today, using this article, we can have some thoughts about how the social media is affecting the clinical trials today and how we're going to use it for later. So the topic, sorry, the article's title is The Outcomes of a Cluster Randomized Control Trial of SoMe Social Media Literacy Program for Improving Body Imaging Related Outcomes in Adolescent Boys and Girls. Kamini and I will be paired for this presentation. This is our second collaboration, and today our advisor is Dr. Irvin. So first, I'd like to let you have some thoughts or comments on the role for the social media in the clinical trials. Any pros and cons while you think about when you're doing clinical trials? There, anyone? Any thoughts? Or at least I can give you some hint for how to let social media to involve in here. So it might get involved in design, conduct, participant, dissemination. So I see that Jasmine, you put it the better PR in the chart. Does you mean that participation here? Oh, okay. Yeah, that's another thing as well. Any other thoughts or comments here? Anyway, we can hold this question for now because I know I just kind of threw it to you and didn't really give you time to think. But first, I would like to talk about the recruitment of the clinical trials we're doing these days. So it's really amazing to know and also surprising to know that the recruitment patient in the clinical trials in the United States is less than 10% of all the patients. And it's not hard to think that among the minority patients, this number must be even lower. And the reason for this, there might be lack of awareness of clinical trials among patients, or strictness of eligibility, or practical concerns. And also one other thing that most people, I can't say most people, but many people will concern is about travel distance, come back and forth, financial costs, and time. So how will these problems be solved, or at least be kind of solved by social media for the clinical trial recruitment? I'm thinking that social media can present opportunities to reach a larger audience through the targeted messages. It's easier to get connected with Wi-Fi than go into one clinic or into an institution in person. And for these days, Facebook and Twitter are the most commonly used platforms. I think people all have preference, but at least one of these will be covered in your apps in your cell phone there. And also using social media can increase the awareness, and it's easier to reach populations. No need to mention that it can be rapid while spreading the message, and without the traveling, it can be cost effective. But definitely there will be some concerns that people might brought up, like for the privacy, about the confidentiality issues and other ethical considerations. So I'll leave all this information here so people can think about all these while we are going through this topic. And for how to use social media by the trial participants, there is some guidance already out there, since everyone has concerns about how we're gonna use social media to recruit patients. One of them is the ADAPT framework. So it has 5 steps that people can use it, can follow this as a guidance when they design their clinical trials with social media involved. And the first part is assess social media risks. So we can have a discussion about when and how will social media pose risks to a study. With this, then we design the study to minimize those risks, and then we will educate our participants and also the study designers and other healthcare providers about how to use social media and how that will impact the trials. The fourth one is preempt problems. So we need to offer, especially for the investigators, we need to offer alternative resources for the participants. The next one will be additional steps people need to take if needed. Okay, so after kind of a brief background for the social media, I have another question for you. If you are using social media as an intervention in your clinical trials, what is the target population, or what kind of age or professional or location with this population you may consider first in your study design? Any thoughts?
Daisy, can I ask for a clarification? Do you mean using social media to advertise or recruit for a clinical trial, or actually incorporate it into the intervention?
Anything. As long as it's involved, what kind of target population people might consider as the most suitable population.
And
it's just an open question.
Yeah, and it could be that using social media to actually implement your intervention, that's one. And other is incorporating aspects of social media within the design of the intervention itself, right? So there are different means. And I think even the slide before that, I think we were touching on another topic, which is the actual use of social media by participants while they are actively enrolled in the trial. And what are some of those sorts of considerations and things that we have to be aware of? And I think also one of the questions that we asked in the email reminder was that should we be including information about social media use by participants in our informed consent documents? And that was another question that we thought would be interesting to ask before we talk about this idea of the social media actually being involved in the intervention itself.
Yeah, we have Edward's hands up. Could you unmute yourself and say something?
Yeah, hi Daisy.
Yeah.
So I guess the target population would be those who use social media, right? So the age group probably would be younger ages, starting from adolescents and maybe to middle age people. And actually I find this topic really interesting because myself, I've been seeing commercials or at least ads on my Facebook page and my Instagram page that are recruiting patients. For example, like Johns Hopkins Medicine or societies like American Society of Oncology. But I don't know if it's because I follow their pages so that I just received these messages, but I'm just find it very interesting. But I'm also wondering that these studies are targeting social media users. However, that's because I follow their pages and I'm interested in medicine, so I received these messages. However, if they are targeting their targeted population are not necessarily people who are interested in medicine, then they probably would not receive these messages. Yeah, just my thought.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. And I really wanted to say that as long as we're following something, the internet or the website will kind of pop up with some suggestions that to hope that we can look into their websites. So, Dr. Hobart?
Hi, I was just going to say that we've used social media mainly as a means to advertise about the trial. And kind of the things that we have used are geofencing, so you can figure out, be confident that your ads are going to locations that are within range of your clinical centers, if that's important. And demographic variables, that you can target your ads towards age groups or specific genders.
Yeah. So for the social media related interventions in the clinical trials, I think there are at least two aspects we can think about. The first is social media delivered interventions. So we are using social media as a way to kind of post things so people can really receive. And the other aspect is that the interventions are directly targeting the social media use and its impact. So these are, at least for now, the two main aspects social media related interventions in the clinical trials that people mostly interested in. And while we are designing the research that involves social media, we really need to determine whether we can effectively delivering the message we wanted to deliver, and whether those messages are acceptable and feasible to the target population we wanted to let them receive. The other thing is that social media intervention can be effective in certain populations, as Edward said, for teenagers, adults who have access to Wi-Fi and cell phones, but there are also limitations and disadvantages, like for elderly who don't really have very much access to this stuff. It might be harder to reach them using social media designed clinical trials than to let them come into the clinic in person. So those are all the things we need to consider when we are trying to put into social media into our clinical trials there. And the next one is, I just wanted to let you guess for the access to social media among the teenagers in the United States. I'm pretty sure that everyone thinks this is going to be a high percentage, but anyone wanted to at least guess for a range for the shared cell phone access among the teens or the shared computer access to the teens? Let's say whether it's 60%, 70%, 90%, or something like this. Just a guess. You can just unmute and say the word.
90.
Any other guesses? It's pretty close. But it can be even higher. So this is the data from 2018 that for the cell phone access, that among the girls is 97% coverage, and for the boys it's 93% coverage. And I'm pretty sure this data gonna be updated after the pandemic because everyone is working virtually. So most of the things we are doing online, so people will have higher access to computers and cell phones based on what we have here. So it's very interesting to see this, but it's also amazing. Okay, so back to our article today. So this is on the top here. It's the article we're going to talk about, and the bottom is also their study protocol that the authors provide that people can look into. And for the background and objective for this article, first, I'd like to say that since social media is so highly used among the teenagers, there are a lot of pressure coming from those media platforms. So for teenagers, besides media, they also have pressure from parents and peers, and we don't really need to guess that high social media use, or at least the media use, can lead to high dissatisfaction to their body, and they will have appearance pressure, and there are more and more eating disorder cases being reported among the teenagers. And for the social media literacy intervention, it is focused on developing social media literacy skills and teaching strategies to challenge personal reactions to the exposure to the social media. And for this article, it's actually using social media as an intervention and try to find the efficacy of one of the social media literacy program called SoMe in improving adolescents' body image related outcomes and well-beings. And the study design type is a cluster randomized controlled trial design. So I'll pass it to Kamini from here.
Thank you, Daisy. Hi, everyone. I'm Kamini, and I'll be leading forward the discussion with methodology and result. Please let me know if you cannot hear me or have trouble hearing me at any time because I have some internet issues. Okay, so the participants for this trial were mainly grade 7 and grade 8 students in the range, the age group of 11 to 15 years who attended school in November 2017 to August 2019. So if their grade was selected to receive the intervention, all the students in their grade received the 4-lesson program as part of their school curriculum. However, only those students whose parents actually consented or were eligible to participate in the research. Most schools, that is, there were total 8 schools who participated in this trial, and 6 of them required the written active parental consent, whereas 2 schools used informed opt-out parental consent, whereby parents could actively choose to withdraw their child from the research. So before moving on, can someone tell me the difference between active and passive consent, or is there any difference between the active and passive consent? Because before doing this study, I did not even know that there are 2 types of consent. So I just want to understand if anyone else has this issue as well.
So in my understanding, active consent is you go to the participant, you explain the study, and then they actively agree to participate. So they sign something or something like this. And passive consent, for example, in a hospital, when patients are admitted, they get all the papers, and within the paperwork, it's stated your data may be used in a research project. And if they don't reject, then their data can be used. This would be passive for me, but correct me if I'm using a wrong definition in my head.
No, that is correct. The first one is the active consent is the one in which participants are required to give their consent in order to participate, that they should agree to participate in the trial, whereas a passive parental consent is the one in which participants are usually considered as a part of a trial unless they specifically ask to withdraw their name from the study. In my opinion, I believe that passive consent is somewhat ethically questionable, because here the parents were required to sign and return the form if they refuse to allow their child to be a part of this trial. But that might mean that some of the parents could have even missed these forms. If the child wouldn't have given it to them, then parents would not know that their children are a part of the study. But the type of consent would differ depending on the setting of the clinical trial. The schools were all from Australia, so they might have different ethical considerations and guidelines. But even for passive consenting, IRB approval is required, and it has a certain set of criteria listed that the study should have no more than minimal risk to a participant, among other such criteria. And if the study meets that criteria, then it can be allowed to take passive consent. So moving on to the intervention, SoMe, a social media literacy body image, which had dieting and well-being program for high school students, was of 4 50-minute lessons. And this lesson, these lessons were experimental and interactive and aimed to empower adolescents with skills to critique social media postings, including advertisements, celebrity postings, and even their friends' personal pages. Students actually considered realism in social media, developed strategies to respond to negative feedback, explored how social media can be used to bring about a positive social change, and most importantly, they also reflected on and actually practiced how to present their real selves in social media with little emphasis on the appearance. So I see Edward has
one question, just
Yeah.
to interrupt you. Edward posted
Yes.
a question.
So there is a possibility that the parents, so that was what my concern was as well in case of passive consenting. that they might not have been aware that the data is being collected for the study. But anyways, the program was implemented for all the grades, for all the students in a grade. Only the data was collected if they gave consent. So I do believe that there could have been scenarios where parents, not like some of the parents were not aware of what is going on. But we are not sure because that wasn't mentioned in the manuscript or the trial protocol. Okay, so Daisy, can you take to the next slide, please? Okay, so this is how the authors thought that the social media program, that this intervention would actually work. It was underpinned by an etiological perspective, which proposed that a reduction in causal risk factors or an increase in the protective factors for a problem will disrupt the developmental sequence and thereby result in a reduced likelihood that the problem will occur. So SOMI endeavored to provide early adolescents with critical social media literacy skills to counteract the detrimental effects of social media exposure. The intervention was delivered by trained facilitators who received 2 half-day training workshops run by one of the authors who designed the intervention. In addition, each facilitator also observed a session of the intervention being delivered by one of the authors. So the authors made sure that they were consistent, that there was consistency in the delivery of the intervention in all the schools and across all the grades. So my next question is, what do you feel would influence a participation of a subject or a patient in a clinical trial or any study for that matter? Or else, what do you think the factors would have influenced for participation in this trial? That's convenience, yes, of course. Any other comments? Incentives, yes. I do believe that incentives are sometimes considered as a priority for participation in a clinical trial, though it shouldn't be, but that's what, whenever there's a flyer of a clinical trial, they have this written in bold that participants get $25 gift card or $50 for participation. And they're like, oh, I get just $50 for participation. And they don't even bother going through the what the eligibility criteria is. And then, yeah, incentive is has a major role to play in this. So we also came up with some factors that could influence. One of them is curiosity, which I believe is should be the most important one, but it is given less importance. The other could be the use of social media as an intervention tool here. Considering we saw that there are more than 90% of adolescents who use social media on a regular basis, then this would have been interesting. Also, social media is not frequently used as an intervention. So this could be something new that participants might have felt or their parents might have felt is involved, and they would be interested in seeing what is going on or what this intervention does. There are also a lot of growing concerns about body negativity these days, and parents would have felt that being a part of this intervention could help their child gain body positivity, and therefore they would have encouraged their children to participate. And there's also a factor called, we said as influence, wherein one participant influences the other participant to basically be a part of a trial, or in this case, a parent might have encouraged another parent to allow their child to be a part of this trial. Yes, health literacy is also important. Thank you, Edward, for that. So this was a clustered randomized or a group allocation clinical trial, as we call it. The basic difference between a cluster and a group and a regular randomized control trial is that of a cluster. Here, the randomization unit is a group rather than an individual. So here in this clinical trial, the randomization unit or the cluster was a school. If the grade of a school was selected to receive the intervention, all the students in that grade receive that intervention as a part of the curriculum. And let us spend some time going over the advantages and disadvantages of cluster RCT. If there is any first year clinical trials track student who wants to take the opportunity to review their concepts for the comps part B and go over the advantages and disadvantages of of cluster randomized trial? Okay.
I'm not a first year student, so I can jump in. So cluster randomized trials, you have advantages if you're assuming that the group can't be separated, so the individuals within the group are more likely to each other compared to other groups, and might influence each other. So for example, you say you can't separate the individuals out. So if you're in a school and you would make an individualized randomization, you might have the fear that the other students will talk about the intervention, and so your intervention won't be separated anymore.
Yes, so that's something we called as contamination of the control group, but the individual randomization and the cluster trial is mostly used when individual randomization is not feasible or is not acceptable in some situations, or when the intervention are by their own nature are meant to be applied to a whole community instead of an individual. Here we had the school as a community. And also, like Alexandra said, contamination could be an issue. To prevent that, we have a cluster randomized trial. And also in some situations, cluster randomized trial offer more logistical convenience. They also allowed for both direct and indirect effects of an intervention to be captured, and therefore looking at the overall effect of an intervention. This is particularly important in case of infectious disease, where you want to check the direct effect of an intervention and also the indirect, that is the herd immunity effect of the intervention. The disadvantages might be that the power and precision of a randomized trial are in itself lower as compared to an individually randomized trial. If there is correlation in responses within a group, then the trial might lose some of its efficiency. And there could be other issues of selection bias, imbalance between the study arms, and also the generalizability of the findings of this study to another groups. So yeah, we just went over the randomization advantages and disadvantages. Daisy, can you move to the next slide? Great. So here, schools were categorized as small if there were 4 or less grade per level, and large if they were greater than 4 classes per grade level. Separate blocks were used due to sequential recruitment of schools and likely differences in number of students within each grade level between schools. This is mainly to prevent the substantial variation in sample size across groups that could otherwise occur if all schools were included in one block, regardless of size, because then one school might have contributed more number of students than the other schools. So we have a flowchart which shows how the block randomization would have done. Let's take one school out of 8 schools. There were 2 grades in each school. They used block randomization to assign the intervention in one grade and the control to the other grade. And in total, 892 students participated in this trial, of which 483 received the intervention and 409 received the control arm, that was lessons as usual. So can we mask the participants? Can we mask the participants here? What do you think?
Just if you provide them with a mock intervention, which is not as suited as your intervention or it has a different topic. But here it wasn't done this way. At least I didn't see it.
Yeah, so it wasn't done that way. You're right, Alexandra. And also considering the nature of the intervention and the fact that the students were the ones who answered who basically answered the questionnaires and were the ones who evaluated the outcomes, we could not have masked these participants. The authors hypothesized that participants receiving SOMI would report decreased body weight dissatisfaction, dietary restraint, and strategies to increase muscle, which were the primary outcome variables, and elevated self-esteem and reduced depressive symptoms, which were the secondary outcomes. These outcomes were evaluated at baseline, 1 week post-intervention from baseline, then at 6 months from baseline, and again at 12 months from baseline. And the findings were compared between the intervention and the no intervention group. There was also a change. There was also one more exploratory outcome which the authors evaluated. That is a change. They hypothesized that the change within the intervention group would occur due to reduced internalization of appearance ideals and appearance comparison. So they considered this as as exploratory outcome variables. So all these were the various outcome measures which were used depending on the study objectives to evaluate the intervention effect. These measures have previously been shown to have good validity and reliability in adolescent samples, as it was checked by the Cronbach's alpha. The Cronbach alpha uses the split half reliability method. In this method, we divide the questions into 2 halves and administer them and see how the answers correlate. So using the Cronbach alpha, which takes the mean of all possible split halves. So if an Cronbach alpha is more than 0.7, it is usually considered as adequate. So if we see here, all the values were greater than 0.7 with just the questionnaire of self-esteem having a value of 0.71, but it was still more than 0.7. So all these indicated good reliability measures. Daisy, just can you? So I just wanted to, seeing the time, I'm not going to go through all the questionnaires, but I just want to provide what all what the basic finding of the result would be. So if you see in all the above questionnaires, only a higher score for the single item self-esteem and 3 item from the Rosenberg self-esteem scale, which was used to check the self-esteem. If there was a higher score for that, that would show an improvement in the intervention group, or a greater score would indicate a positive outcome. Whereas for all the other questionnaires, a greater score or an increase in score would indicate a poor effect of the intervention. And then the questionnaires were, as I said before, were administered at baseline, 1 week post-intervention, 6 month post-baseline, again at 12 month post-baseline. The authors also collected data regarding demographics such as age, gender, country of birth, language spoken at home, and the postcode, the area where they resided. All these data was collected during the class time. Moving on to the sample size and statistical analysis, the sample size was calculated as a priori power analysis, which revealed that a sample size of 350 boys and 350 girls, which is about 700 participants, allowing for a 30% attrition, would have sufficient power to detect the small to medium effects of 0.3 between the groups. Scale scores were marked as missing for adolescents who responded.
Sorry to interrupt you. Just one question about the power analysis. Maybe the faculty can chime in if you don't know the question. I was surprised, shouldn't it be calculated as a cluster randomized trial and not using the individuals? Because when I was reading the protocol, I had the impression they were treating the sample size calculation as it would be an individualized randomized control trial.
Dr. Irwin, do you want to take this question? I'm not sure.
Oh, yes, yeah, I believe that might be the case, Alexandra. I would ask also Dr. Holbrook, because she may have more experience than I do with the cluster randomized trials. But I believe this might be, you might be correct with this, Alexandra.
I think there are kind of 2 types of cluster randomized trial. One where the outcome is measured in individuals, and you sort of do the analysis. You have 800 records if you have 800 individuals, and in that case, I think that the sample size needs to take into account the correlation among individuals in a cluster. There is, kind of where the outcome might be the mortality rate in a community or something like that. that the outcomes actually measured at the community level, then you would expect the trial or the sample size to actually reflect the number of communities or clusters that you need. That is at least what my understanding is.
Thank you. And just in line with this, I think in the methods they said they will take correlation between repeated measures, so from the same individual into account, but I didn't see that they took actually the cluster into account. Did I miss something there, or did they not specify it very clearly? Because my understanding from your answer is they should have taken just the correlation of the cluster into account.
I agree that I had the same question, that they didn't at least specify, but they should have taken it into account. And, you know, we often come about this problem in eye studies because people have two eyes. And so we have to take that into account along with the repeated measures. And, you know, you have to do both of those things. And so I don't think they at least stated adequate analysis for handling the clustering within the individuals for the repeated measures, and then the clustering within the classroom.
Yeah, they didn't, but what they just mentioned in the manuscript was they did conduct preliminary testing to evaluate the clustering effect of school, but all the random effects were close to zero. And in some cases, they even failed, the model failed to converge. So they didn't make any adjustment for school in the final analysis. That's what they mentioned in their manuscript.
Thank you all. Sorry for the interruption, but
Oh,
I was
great
very curious
discussion.
about this. Thank you.
Great discussion. Okay, so we were looking at the missing data. So scale scores were marked as missing for all adolescents who responded to less than 70% of the items on a scale, and linear mixed models were used for all outcome measures. While the study protocol did indicate that internalization of appearance ideals and appearance comparison would mediate changes in the outcome variables in the intervention group, actually few significant intervention effects were found overall. And therefore, the authors decided to run these two variables as therefore, the authors decided to run the exploratory analysis using these two variables, and they presented the findings in terms of exploratory variables. Analysis were run on a full sample and also on the ones who completed the study, and subgroup analysis for girls and boys were also done to check if there was any difference in the intervention effect. Effect size were reported as standardized mean differences with value of 0.2 considered small, 0.5 moderate, and 0.8 or more were considered as large. Across all the variables, the amount of missing data actually ranged between 0 to 26%, and missing data was handled using multiple imputations with overall 50 imputations in the model. So we'll now look into the results. So this is a flow chart of the participants. A total of 892 participants completed at least one survey over the 4 time points. There were around 775 at baseline, 740 at post-intervention, around 700 at 6-month follow-up, and around 685 at 12-month follow-up who completed the questionnaires. The table 2 present group differences in baseline characteristics. Participants in the control group were significantly younger, less likely to have come from the public school, and were less likely to report English as their primary language spoken at home. There were no differences between the groups in characteristics for BMI, gender distribution, indigenous status, or whether participants completed overall survey. The table 3 shows the intervention effect for a full sample analysis, adjusting for age, language, and school type, as we just saw that there were significant differences in the group between these 3 variables. The only outcome measure to show different rate of changes across group was drive for increased masculinity with the effect size of 0.19. Although there was a decline in drive for masculinity from baseline to 12-month follow-up for the sample overall, unexpectedly, this decline was much weaker for individuals in the intervention arm of the study as compared to the control arm. A similar pattern was also emerged with the sample when the sample was limited to study completers. I have not included that in the slide because it was a very huge table, but I can show the supplement at the end of the presentation. And when the analysis was done using only the ones who completed the study, it revealed similar findings, and contrary to expectations, controlling for school type, the decline in drive for masculinity from baseline to 12-month follow-up was also weaker for individuals in the intervention as compared to the control group. The authors did analysis separately for girls and boys also. And for girls, 2 significant group by time effects were emerged when it was run. First, you can see that the control group showed slightly increased in dietary restraint from baseline to 6-month follow-up. The intervention group exhibited reduced symptoms. The second was that increase in depressive symptoms experienced for the sample overall from baseline to 6-month follow-up were weaker for the girls in intervention group as compared to the control group. There were 3 significant group by time effects which were observed for boys, whereas the dietary restraint behavior reduced from baseline to 12-month follow-up for both groups. Unexpectedly, this effect was much weaker for the intervention arm. Similarly, the intervention arm did show a decrease in drive for masculinity from baseline to a 12-month follow-up, but the control arm showed a much larger decline in this behavior. But third, as predicted, the intervention group showed an increase in self-esteem from baseline to 6-month follow-up, whereas the self-esteem score declined for the control group. The intervention had different effect for girls and boys, and it could be said that it was more beneficial in girls as compared to boys. Daisy will lead the discussion further.
Thank you, Kamini. So for the discussion, as what we saw from the results, that it is very different from their hypothesis. For the total sample they did, the analysis they did, the intervention was not associated with the improvement in the body dissatisfaction and other outcomes, no matter primary outcome or secondary outcome. And the only difference to emerge in full and completer samples was for drive for the masculinity. So whereby weaker declines were found in the intervention group related to the control group. And there are benefits showed in the intervention. There are benefits for the intervention showed in the girls in terms of dietary restraint and depressive symptoms at 6 months follow-up related to the controls, but it appears to be less effective among boys. So there is a gender difference, but it's very weak. And for the limitation of the study, the author listed several. The first thing is that it's hard to measure whether the intervention was delivered effectively. And the second one is that there are chances and factors that will affect the intervention effects, like the participant engagement, motivation, and initiative to change. So this might be low in the present samples and can result in fewer intervention effects. And also, for the nature and power of the social media platform themselves can also be considered to influence the final results we have, because as itself, social media is very difficult to disengage from, and there are interactions between the students themselves and the interventions along this classroom level. So people will have communication between their use or their feedback for all these interventions they use. Edward?
Yeah, so I'm just wondering in this cluster randomization design, if there are people who change across the clusters, but they receive the same intervention, would that affect the analysis? I mean, because like in this study, it is intention to treat, right? But if in a scenario that a patient or a subject changed the cluster, but he or she still received the same intervention, would that change the analysis?
You mean the students transfer from school to school, that change of cluster, this kind of thing, or?
Yeah, something like that.
Oh, wow, this is very detailed. I don't think the authors mentioned that in the protocol or in the final article there. And also for the study, it is 6 months, 12 months follow-up. It's just 1 year. So there might be chances for this kind of thing, but I think they might add it into the missing data if they lost the follow-up, but I'm not sure. Okay, I'm gonna move on. So the author also gave some suggestions for the future social media related research. It has 3 points, and I try to combine and summarize those. The first one is that when we are thinking about study population, we really need to identify for whom the intervention may be most useful for exploring individual moderating factors. So try to figure out the most suitable target population for our study. And the second one, the participation also needs to be considered because the ways to increase the intervention dose and potentialize the intervention effects needs to be think about. Like for this study, we might want to add into booster sessions to improve the results or add future interventions to the existing curriculums, or that we can use other paired educational style interventions with technology-based interruptions to kind of strengthen our outcomes. So these are the suggestions and advices from this article. And also we need to think about the peer pressure. So I try to conclude what they say in the article there because they are thinking about they are trying to emphasize that there are potential negative impacts of social relationships about social media and about the peers in the study. So these all need to be taken into consideration when we are trying to analyze the outcome. And for the final conclusion for this article, the first point is that the demand for social media body image intervention for the adolescents is high, no need to say. And the second is that their findings were overall modest in terms of the intervention effects, and also the findings among girls indicate that the intervention was valuable in several outcomes, but there are few positive effects among the boys. So taking together, these findings provide preliminary support for school-based social media literacy interventions, particularly among adolescents and girls. And no need to say that future study needs to be added. So that's all for our presentation. Thank you so much. Any questions? Or comments?
Great job. Well, thank you both. It was a really great presentation.
Thank you. I'll stop the recording for now.